many a time. Welcome, everyone. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. I hope everybody can hear me okay from the Rocky Mountains and Crested Butte. We want to welcome you to this evening's special program on the U.S. Constitution and voting rights, featuring Dr. Annie Johnson Benefield. Dr. Benefield is a nationally recognized voting rights champion and current president of LWV Houston. She offered to speak to Gunnison Valley LWV as part of Colorado's celebration of African American History Month, and we are honored to accept. Dr. Benefield has been a member of LWV Houston for more than 20 years, serving in a variety of hardworking positions, including Secretary of the Board, Voter Services Chair, and currently as Houston's president. She is the first African American to serve in that capacity since the organization formed more than 100 years ago. Dr. Benefield recently retired as chair of the Political Science Department at Lone Star College, Tomball, where she taught government and other courses for 23 years. Benefield also developed programs for civic education and involvement of students in the broader Houston community. She won the Helen Hunter Award in 2019 for her work and throughout Harris County and with the League. Benefield has won numerous other awards, including the LSC Tomball Faculty Excellence Award in 2019, the Chamber of Commerce Teacher of the Month Award in November 2021, and LSC Tomball Advanced Faculty Howell Award in 2020. Just a couple of quick housekeeping matters. Our Zoom host is Katina in Denver with LWV Colorado. Following normal webinar procedures, all participants are muted. If you have any questions for Dr. Benefield, please submit them through the Zoom chat feature at the close of her remarks. Thank you for joining us. And now over to you, Dr. Benefield.
Thank you so much for having me. When I initially reached out to Sherry and say, what are you all doing for African American History Month? And she said, I don't know whether you all had something already planned, but anyway, this event tended to grow in volumes, much in numbers than I expected. I expected to speak to a small group of maybe 12 to 15 people. And then I think I have no idea how many people on, but I am honored that Sherry and I came to be friends more so through the internet and through phone calls and email communication than anything else. This is every opportunity I get to actually talk about voting and the U.S. Constitution or talk about voting rights. I'm pretty passionate about it, and it shows in ways that sometimes it seems as if I'm screaming like a banshee, as opposed to a normal person talking about something that means a lot. So tonight we're going to talk about the United States Constitution and voting rights, and I want to have a conversation and to be more casual as opposed to being more formal in this presentation. I was trying to figure out exactly how to approach this topic, but then I said, you have to talk about the League of Women Voters, and it's 103 years. Last week on Valentine's Day, we celebrated 103 years of the League in existence. And one of the things is that the League empowers voters and defend democracy. And this is Carrie Chapman Catt was the founder of the League of Women Voters in 1920. So this 103-year history is something to be proud of, to celebrate, and to be excited about. And the League here in the Houston area will also celebrate its 103rd anniversary because it became a League chapter during that time period. So the League was established in 1920. All of you know that because you're probably League members. And those who are not, you get to know something fun and exciting that this organization has a century-old history of advocating for women and the right to vote, informing and educating women. And most of the League of Voters, League of Women Voters, produce something called a voter's guide and Vote 411 to educate people, not just women, but to educate the population in terms of who are the candidates, what are the issues, what's the pros and cons associated with a particular referendum or ballot measure, and advocate for voter education. Because in order for democracy to persevere, to remain stable and sound as an institutional structure, people need to participate. In order to participate, you need to be educated about the issue. And so one of the things the League advocate for is political participation. We want people to actively engage. And this year, for the first year, the League of Women Voters here in Houston had a Get Out to Vote rally in a historic area, Emancipation Park, which was land that had been formerly owned by enslaved people and now conservatory. It's a beautiful park. And we had people from that community and from surrounding communities to come and talk about voting rights. And so the League's first charge is to educate women on how to exercise their new political right after more than a 72-year struggle. Because one of the major events associated with women in suffrage was the 1848 Cynical Fall Conference, where people spoke about it. And Sojourner Truth gave her famous speech, Ain't I a Woman? Even though this slide seems misplaced here, but in the struggle for women's suffrage, women were carrying around this sign, President Wilson, this is the time to support women's suffrage. Apparently, even though President Wilson was not a firm advocate and supporter of a woman's right to vote and participate in the political process. So what is voting? It's an active choice that individuals perform when they formally choose among alternative candidates, parties, and depending on the election, alternative issues. Here in Texas, when the state legislature passed a ballot measure, they sent it to the states, and it only requires a simple majority of voters to actually vote on it, and it becomes part of the state constitution. That is pretty dramatic, that it only takes a simple majority to become part of the state constitution. So the Texas Constitution is a fairly long document because every time the legislature meet, they usually propose 5 or more amendments, and the voters simply go out and vote. And it's very rare that amendments are rejected. Abraham Lincoln had this to say about the ballot. The ballot is stronger than the bullet. So it has much more power and impetus in a political society. And voting is the way by which people get an opportunity to engage in the political process, to express their interests, to express their preferences, to allow their leaders to know what it is that they're thinking and what they desire is public policy. But over the history of the United States, as in some other countries as well, actually getting the right to vote has been a difficult and arduous process. So these are some of the barriers that have existed to voting. Age, gender, property, you had to own property, residency, you had to establish residence. In some states required that you had to live there for more than a year before you could actually register to cast a ballot. Mental competency, here in Texas, it's in the Constitution, it says lunatics and idiots can't vote. And who's the person that gets to decide what a lunatic and what an idiot is? That becomes a whole different issue. But just to let you know what's happening here, literacy. Literacy could mean any number of things. That the equivalency now is the assumption that you have a 6th grade education, so that would be considered a literate person. More and good character tests. These were some of the things put in place. A poll tax. States had poll taxes you had to pay. It ranged from $1 to $1.50 to $1.75 or $2 that you had to pay it in advance of being able to cast a ballot and participate in the political process. If in some states, if you're a felon, you can't, after you've been convicted of a felon, and even after serving your time. In Florida, they had fixed it so you couldn't vote. People put a petition on the measure, it passed by 64% of the vote. Then the legislature, people went back to the legislature and passed a measure that said you had to pay all back dues and fees associated with your trial and our incarceration. So that basically disenfranchised, because nobody had kept track or tally of the fees. And so some voters in Florida are still disenfranchised as a direct result of that. Here in Texas, the moment after you've served your time, you're no longer, as they call it on paper, you can actually register and vote. And so you've heard probably of some incidents across the country about individuals not being able to, in Florida was arrested, they registered, and they subsequently voted. And now they've been arrested for supposedly voter fraud because they weren't supposed to be eligible. But they registered, the state processed the paperwork, and they were allowed to register and to vote. And now they've been arrested. Some of the charges have been dropped by the local district attorneys because they felt that this was unfair. And so the state legislature has passed the law that you could actually, a prosecutor in some other community or the attorney general can intervene in terms of prosecuting people. Registration, in some states you had to register so far in advance of the actual election that would deter people from actually casting a ballot. And race was one of the predominant issues, became one of the issues associated with disenfranchisement of people in the process, particularly formerly enslaved people. As you can see from some of these pictures, that women's suffrage involved in our history of talking about suffrage and voting rights, that women have gone and other groups have gone through tremendous barriers trying to secure the right to vote and participate in the political process. Women were jailed. They were put in institution. Forced feedings took place. Some really horrendous things happened in our history and our culture about this. In terms of Black suffrage, there was assassinations that took place in that process. And different groups actually perceived getting suffrage very differently. Some thought that the best way to advocate for getting the right to vote was at the state level. Others thought that advocating at the national level in terms of getting a constitutional amendment. And so in this voting right clip, this is showing the Selma to Montgomery March, where John Lewis, who was a civil rights activist.
There were no police in sight. The route out of Selma crossed over the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
Cheyenne and I went to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. There, I turned around and left Cheyenne. Simply because I'm telling you, I was afraid.
Waiting on the other side were Alabama state troopers, under orders from Governor Wallace to stop the marchers. Clark's posse was on the sidelines.
It'll be detrimental to your safety to continue this march, and I'm saying that this is an unlawful assembly. You have to disperse. You are ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church. This march will not continue. Is that clear to you? I've got nothing further to say to you.
I could remember was outbursts.
Subsequent to that particular, the interruption, the trial at Nuremberg was playing on ABC channel, and they broke into that program and to show the footage from this particular incident on the Edmunds Pettus Bridge. And as a direct result of this, President Lyndon Johnson decided that he would take up the gauntlet in terms of the fight for voting rights. And the Voting Rights Act, the march did take place, and he provided federal troops in terms of the march from Selma to Montgomery. The federal court allowed for that, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. And for the first time, and I'm integrating personal stuff in there, as a result of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, my parents were able to register to vote, and in 1968 was able to cast their first ballot for the President of the United States. So voting and the US Constitution. The United States Constitution does not grant universal suffrage in terms of saying that every citizen who's born and eligible have the right to vote and participate in the political process. It's pretty much been a piecemeal kind of deal that has taken place. In most places, these are some of the qualifications that you have to have in order to vote and participate in the political process. 18 years old, current day, a resident of a state or of a county or a parish, cannot be a felon, must be mentally competent. These are some of the things. And so in our history of the United States, one of the most interesting things that I found that was fascinating, where we are engaging in a dialogue about restriction of voting rights and access to the process, and talking about electoral integrity and election integrity and preventing voter fraud. The reality is, if you look at the United States Constitution, it has had 27 amendments, with one amendment repealing. The only time that the government decided to, a constitutional amendment was passed that regulated social behavior in terms of prohibition, people drinking. And then that amendment was subsequently repealed. So 26 amendments of valid parts of the United States Constitution. And of those, the first 10 of those amendments were added in 1791. After that, only 16 other amendments are actually a part of the Constitution. And of that 16, 6 deal with the expansion of voting rights. And that's why I wanted to talk about that tonight, that the Constitution has been much more expansive in giving people access and the right to vote and participate in the political process than one might think. Probably more amendments dealing with that, other than structural issues, is the primary impetus for the United States Constitution. So the 15th Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1870, the 17th Amendment in 1913. The 19th Amendment in 1920, everybody here knows about that one. The 23rd Amendment in 1961, the 24th Amendment in 64, and the 26th Amendment in 1971. So the 15th Amendment to the Constitution was part of what was called the Civil War Amendments. The 13th Amendment eliminated slavery as an institutional structure in the United States. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship for the formerly enslaved individuals, and it provided equal protection and due process. So the 15th Amendment was, the impetus was for it to grant Black males who had been formerly enslaved the right to vote and participate in the political process. However, it wasn't long, and my grandfather, I figure I'll tell his story because he was a young man. His mom was bought in Virginia as a slave. He, along with his mom, was bought in Virginia, and they was transported to Alabama. Somebody in Alabama bought them, and as a boy. And then subsequently, he was enslaved. And then the 13th Amendment granted freedom. The 14th Amendment gave him citizenship, and the 15th Amendment would have given him the right to vote and participate in the political process. James Jim Johnson. I thought he was a kind of good-looking guy. Subsequently, after that time period, in terms of the 17th Amendment was added during the Progressive era. The original Constitution said that the state legislature would select senators, not individuals. But the 17th Amendment allowed for the direct popular election of United States senators. In some states, they had already changed the system and allowed through the primary process, But this amendment to the Constitution in 1913 allowed for the people to have a voice and have a say instead of the state legislature choosing the United States senators. And so Augustus Bacon, a Democrat from Georgia, was the first senator directly elected in terms of the 17th Amendment. And then I've heard our former governor, Rick Perry, wrote a book, and he was arguing for the repeal of the 17th Amendment to go back to the idea of the state legislature selecting senators as opposed to the direct popular election. So he was for, in a sense, recension of voting rights. And then you had the women's suffrage movement. I touched upon it a little bit, but these are some of the names and faces that you see associated with women's suffrage. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Alice Paul, Lucretia Mott, a whole succession of women. And depending on where you live, you would never know that there were other women who were involved in the struggle. Originally, the 19th Amendment was proposed in 1878, but it wasn't passed by this House and the Senate until 1919 and subsequently ratified. And so the League of Women Voters celebrate Women Equality Day on August 26th. That's when the Secretary of State certified it. So Susan B. Anthony. But even before the 19th Amendment became part of the Constitution, some areas in the United States allowed for people to vote, any other women to vote, out west in particular. They were much more likely to allow places like Colorado, Wyoming, and other states were much more likely to allow for women the right to vote than on the Eastern Seaboard, because they considered women delicate. But out west, women had to work hard. I mean, it was a rough life out on the frontiers. And so as a result of that, 16 states actually allowed women the right to vote prior to the 19th Amendment being ratified. And so these are some of the states, as you can see. You're in good company that Colorado was one of those states in the mix. And Jeanette Rankins from Montana got elected to the United States House of Representatives before the 19th Amendment became part of the Constitution, just as a trivial tidbit in terms of history. These are some of the other women. Mabel Ping, she was actually an Asian woman and she could not vote because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, but she was very actively engaged in the voting rights struggle and involved in help planning a march that took place. Jovita Adair, she was a Mexican-American journalist. She was involved in fighting for justice in terms of women and getting the right to vote. Because when you educate a woman, you educate a family. And from the research, it indicates that across the country, around the world, in third world countries, if you educate a woman in a household, it totally changed the dynamics of the family in terms of improving the socioeconomic conditions of that particular family. Two Native women, Gertrude Simmons, also known as she was from the Sioux tribe, and she was a Native suffragist. She was involved in the struggle for voting rights. Suzanne La Flèche Picot, she was also a Native American woman involved in the struggle for voting rights for women. And that's Mabel. Benjamin Franklin said, "Today a man owns a jackass worth $50, but he's entitled to vote. But before the next election, the jackass died." And guess what happened? The man can't vote because he no longer owns property. So he cannot engage in the political process, although he knows more as a direct result from being engaged. But now the ass, and I just threw Shep in there as an example of the donkey and the ass, just to create some levity. The District of Columbia. It is amazing that in the history of this country, that the seat of democracy, the capital city, at one point it had over 1 million people living in DC, but it was not a state. So therefore the people or the individuals who lived there did not have the ability to vote for president of the United States, had no ability to have a say in that particular process. So in 1961, the 23rd Amendment became part of the Constitution, which allowed for the District of Columbia to have 3 electoral college votes, which was equivalent to the number of votes of the smallest populated state. And now Wyoming and Vermont, DC actually has more population than those two states, and it has the same electoral college strength. Because we think of DC as statues and monuments in the Capitol. We don't think of it as people living there and needing to have a voice or a say in the electoral process. Another impediment to voting and participating in the political process was voting rights and literacy. Jim Crow instituted a whole wave of things that actually disenfranchised people, that even though Black men, the 15th Amendment allegedly gave them the right to vote and participate in the political process, the truth of the matter is, through Jim Crow legislation, and the Supreme Court played an active role in that. The Supreme Court ruled that the 15th Amendment did not confer the right to vote on anyone. It just simply said you can deny a person the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so as a result of that, we subsequently had the grandfather clause. It is interesting, and some people may not see this as quite funny, illiterate, quite as entertaining. But they said if your grandfather, the grandfather clause said if your grandfather had voted prior to the Civil War, then you could vote. So some of these enslaved people were actually descendants of some of the masters who had voted, but that didn't count in this particular instance in terms of them having the right to vote or participate in the political process. Eventually, the Supreme Court decided that the grandfather clause was unconstitutional. And you had, here in Texas, you had something called the all-white primary, which the Democratic Party was run by by whites. And they had a rule that only whites could vote in the Democratic Party. But if you won the Democratic Party primary, you were automatically considered the elected official for the fall election. So you can participate if you weren't, because the solid Democratic South, after the Civil War, the South became a solidly Democratic place. The Southern states all solidly Democratic in terms of who was voted, who was elected. And so Texas had the all-white primary. The interesting trivial tidbit is that Barbara Jordan's uncle, who was a dentist named Lonnie Smith, he actually, through J.A. Lucas, who was the pastor of the Good Hope Missionary Baptist Church and the president of the NAACP, brought a lawsuit. And the famous case, Smith versus Allwright, and the Supreme Court ruled that the all-white primary was unconstitutional in 1944. And that allowed for some participation by people other than whites in terms of the democratic process. And then the literacy test, Jim Crow institution of the literacy test, that you had to be able to read and write. And sometimes the literacy test included trivial stuff like how many bubbles in a bar of soap, how many grains of sand in a jar, some things that no one could probably answer with all truthfulness and honesty in that process, because there was no way you could know what that was. And interestingly enough, this is a picture of my father because he was drafted during World War II to go fight in World War II. Remember when women were struggling and women had struggled for the right to vote. And then during World War II, my father was drafted to go fight during World War II. And this is showing his discharge papers in January of 1943 when he was honorably discharged from the military. That even though he had been drafted to go fight, he had no say in terms of who made that decision about him.
Work for Mr. Dunn down at the rest home, ain't that right?
Yes, sir.
Wonder what old Dunn will say when I tell him one of his gals down here stirring a fuss.
I ain't stirring no fuss. I'm just here trying to register to vote.
Recite the Constitution's preamble. You know what a preamble is?
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union.
How many county judges in Alabama?
67.
Name them.
So an interesting take, because my father-in-law told a story that he came in with his uniform on. He was drafted during the Korean War, went in Birmingham, Alabama to register to vote. And in addition to filling out the test, then he was asked to name all of the statewide elected officials in the state. And he was not able to name the Secretary of Agriculture, and therefore he was denied that he didn't pass the literacy test. Therefore, he wasn't afforded an opportunity. He said, as he was getting ready to leave the building, a white soldier walked in who had on his uniform, and the election official told him to raise his right hand, duly swore him in, did not administer the test, and said, now you're registered to actually vote. So the idea of what happens in this process in terms of voting rights, different things happen to different people at different points in time. And the literacy test was so complex in some instances, people who had PhDs, had degrees from colleges and universities could not. And I always actually administered the literacy test in my classroom. And one of the questions that students always missed was that the Constitution says that the District of Columbia could be no more than 10 square miles. And that was one of the questions on the test. And no one would ever get that question right, because how would you know that? You would have to be a scholar to know that. So depending on the nature of the questions, like name all 67 county judges, how many people would know that? And probably the six other county judges couldn't name all of the county judges. So that was one of the impossible feats. Here in Texas, but across the country, there was a poll tax. The 24th Amendment to the United States Constitution eliminated the poll tax only in federal elections that affected the president, the vice president, the U.S. House of Representatives and senators, but states could still have the poll tax in their respective states for their local elections. And so the 24th Amendment simply abolished the poll tax in federal election, which expanded the electorate and afforded people with an opportunity to vote and participate. And why was this so important in terms of the poll tax? The poll tax was equivalent to a day's or more wages for a poor person. And you look at it and you say $1 or $2, that doesn't seem to be that much. But when gas was $1, when gas was 25 cents a gallon, you could have bought 4 gallons of gas. You can't do that today, of course, but when gas was 25 cents a gallon, or you could actually buy groceries with $2. You could go to the grocery store and buy a bag of groceries and bring it home to feed your family. So if you had an option between feeding your family or paying a poll tax, what would you do in that process? I would think you would probably actually feed your family as opposed to paying the poll tax. So in 11 southern states, they had to poll tax. In Alabama, Georgia had something called a cumulative poll tax. So if you hadn't paid the poll tax, when you became eligible to vote, allegedly at 21 or whatever, then you would have to pay for all the years in between whenever you got ready to register to vote. And how many people could afford that kind of money in that process? And this is a receipt from the state of Louisiana parish of Jefferson Parish in terms of someone having paid the poll tax. So at this point in time in the 1960s or so, over 10 million people didn't have the price to pay. And sometimes wealthy people took advantage of the poor by paying the poll tax to get them to vote the way that they wanted to. Eventually, though, the Supreme Court ruled that the poll tax was unconstitutional because it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution. And so the poll tax was eliminated. This is my mom. And I integrated her and included her because she was born in 1917 during the struggle for voting rights in terms of suffrage in Alabama in a rural town. She only achieved an 8th grade education because there was no schools for African-American past the 8th grade when she was in school. So the 8th grade was as higher education as she could get. As a result of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, as I told you previously, my dad and my mom registered to vote, and in 1968, cast their first ballot for the president of the United States. And my dad voted for Richard Nixon. He told us that. So that's how we know that he voted for Richard Nixon. And when you look back at history, historical reference point, one of the historians, a political scientist, said Nixon was the last Republican president who was really a Democrat, and that Bill Clinton was the last Democratic president who was really a Republican. An interesting analogy. I thought I'd just throw it in there for good measure. Theodore Loy is a political scientist. He was the person that had that to say about it. But back to my mom, I just want to tell a story that when you had to get an ID for voting, well, actually after September 11th, you had to get an ID. And so after September 11th, in order to fly, to come here to Texas to visit me, I flew home. She and I drove her 25 miles to the county seat, down to the DPS, to get her an ID card. She was 80-some years old at the time. She lived to be 103. So she had a home, bought, transacted, had a bank account and all of those things, and she had never been required to have an ID. So when we got to the DPS, they said, okay, I need her birth certificate. I had never seen a birth certificate. I'd only seen my mom's name written in my grandmother's Bible, but we didn't have that because my grandmother's house burned down at some point, so we didn't have that. So I had to go to the county seat to get a birth certificate, and you could only pay cash or by a certified check or money order. So we got the birth certificate, came back, handed it over to him. And he says, is this the name you want on it? And I said, no, my mom was married to my dad. He said, well, I need a marriage license. So then I had to go over to the county courthouse and get her marriage license. Good they had married in that county. Otherwise, that would have been a daunting task. It wouldn't have happened that day. Went to the county courthouse, got the marriage license, brought it back and gave it to her. Because of her age, I paid for the state issued ID, but they put on it so it wouldn't ever expire because she was 80-some years old. So they figured how long was it going to last? But luckily enough, she actually lived into 2021, which was almost another 20 years past that time period. So that was pretty amazing all by itself, that with a state ID card. So when people talk about what kind of identification you need to vote, to participate in the political process, it isn't so much that the state can give you a free card. It's a supporting documentation that you would need in order for the state to issue you that free card. So I paid for the birth certificate, and then I had to pay for a copy of the marriage license. And depending on what age it is, if you just get a state issued ID, you have to pay the fee, which sometimes is equivalent to that of a driver's license. So that's the other amazing part that takes place in that process. So it isn't as simple and as easy as it is. The 26th Amendment, by all stretch of the imagination, it lowered the voting age to 18 years old. The Vietnam War was in its height. People were protesting and demonstrating on college campuses and university. People were saying, if I can't, why should I be drafted to participate in the military when I don't have a say in terms of the elected officials? And so the voting age, the 26th Amendment was proposed and ratified that lowered the age for voting from 21 to 18. In only 4 states did individuals who were less than 21 could actually vote. Georgia and Kentucky, can you believe it? 18 years old. In Alaska, 19, and in Hawaii, 20. So young voters were basically excluded from the political process, yet they could go and bear arms and fight a war, fight for freedom and democracy around the world, but yet at the same time, they could not participate in the political process. So that's kind of the amazing thing about voting rights. It's been a tug of war. Our Constitution did not provide universal suffrage. It's been a piecemeal, a quilted kind of process. Different laws have been instituted to enfranchise or expand the electorate. Right now, we're going through a retraction in terms of, in some states, you're having a recension of the ability to vote in certain instances. In other states, they expanded. In Texas, the legislature said the last session, they expanded voting rights by allowing a pregnant woman to vote absentee ballot. If she was going to give birth 3 weeks before or 3 weeks after the election, she could actually request the absentee ballot. But other than that, you usually have to have a medical condition, or if you're 65 years old, those are the only condition, or you're going to be out of town for the entire election cycle period, early voting and whatever, that you can request a vote by mail application. And other than that, you can't vote by mail. Whereas in your state, from what I understand, in Colorado, voting by mail is a simply easy process. And so it depends on where you live in America that voting rights can be easy, that voting process can be easy, simple, uncomplicated, whereas in other places, it could be a little bit more restrictive and more difficult. And so that is, I guess that's the patchwork of the framers talking about that it's an experiment. Democracy is an experiment, and that the states are laboratories for change. What works in one state may not work in another state. And as the famous philosopher George Carlin said, if you don't vote, you lose the right to complain. So, any questions? I hope I didn't go, did I go over time? I hope I didn't.
No, there's no time. You're good.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm getting the chat to see if we have any questions. Mostly just comments. Someone says excellent. Someone says, and also Ida B. Wells.
Yes, a strong suffragist, and she was major in terms of the anti-lynching movement. She was a newspaper person and published stories across the South about what was happening in terms of the lynchings that were taking place. And we got anti-lynching legislation only recently. Even though she advocated for it for a long time ago, Congress only passed the anti-lynching legislation more recently, actually within the last year or so, since Biden been president.
Here's a question. How have voting rights in Texas been impacted since the 2020 election?
Well, SB 1 was passed, which means if you take a carload of people and they're not your relatives to a polling locations, then you have to sign a form. If you provide assistance to a person in a polling location, you have to sign a form. You can only read the information to the person. You can't explain things to a person in terms of providing assistance if the person is impaired. More people have registered to vote in Texas, interesting enough. Almost close to 80% of the people eligible to vote are registered to vote, but voter turnout is low. Texas is one of the most difficult states to register. You still can't register online. You have to register. You can go online and fill out the application, but then you have to print it out, sign it, and mail it in. So no online voter registration. Voter turnout is dismal in the state, because in Harris County, where I live, there was 2.55 million people registered to vote in the last election in November, but only 1.1 million of the people in Harris County turned out to vote. And it could have totally changed the dynamics of the political process. So it is having to have ID to vote makes it increasingly more difficult. But one of the things that has happened, early voting time period has been expanded, which allows people a longer time period to actually cast a ballot. In this past election, in the past election in November, rather, they had some problems at the polling location because we've had new machines. Some of the machines, because Harris County has one of the longest ballots in the nation, it took 2 pages, and some of the machines got jammed and stuck, and some of the polling places open late. One of the problems that happened because the Astros won the World Series, so all of the schools were shut down in the area for a huge parade the Monday before. Election day was Tuesday, and many of the polling locations were schools. And so going in and having to set up on the day of the actual election delayed the process. And they had quite a few inexperienced. The majority party in power, which is the Republican Party, quite a few, they are the election judges in polling locations. And many of these people had no prior election experience. So that actually created some slowdowns and some problems at the polling locations. So in Texas, SB 1 has put some wrinkles and caused some slowdowns in the process, but the League of Women Voters here in Houston, we are still out advocating, registering people to vote, trying to make that difference, and partnering with high schools and other community groups trying to get as many people registered as possible. And in the next election cycle, we're going to focus a lot of attention on the get out to vote.
We do have another question. Can you look to the future and project what will stop the recent retractions of voting rights?
If the people who are already registered turn out and vote, turn out and participate in the political process, you can change the dynamics of politics. Albert Einstein said, you can't, you keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. If you sit at home, as the famous philosopher George Carlin said, if you don't vote, you really can't complain. So if you don't engage in the process, my futuristic hope is that people will understand and that the League and other organizations across the state of Texas and across the nation will make the connection to young people and to other people to understand that the reason that you need to participate in the political process because benefits are associated with it. Who you get if you elect a mayor, the mayor gets to choose the police chief. So the policing that happens in your community is very much dependent upon who you've elected, whether you have your streets, the pothole, your trash get picked up. These are things that directly affect you in your community. What kind of schools you have, whether they're providing and accessing the kind of education you want. It depends on if you stay at home, nothing is going to change, honest, because you're not changing the dynamics of things. You are not involved in the political process in the way that you should be.
My goodness, thank you very much. I guess we have one more. What are some projects that LWV Houston does to educate and empower voters? And you kind of just mentioned that.
Yes, the Voter's Guide is a signature voter education document. We partnered, the League of Women Voters here partnered with the Houston Chronicle, and they actually print the Voter's Guide. We produced the Voter's Guide in digital format in 4 languages, of course, English, Spanish, Vietnamese, and Chinese, so those constituent populations. Last year, I did an interview with the Vietnamese radio station, and we actually advertised on social media. We paid for ads on social media to reach out in the indigenous languages so that we can reach that population group. We tried that, and we advertised on Instagram. And so social media, I'm thinking that we need to partner with the high schools and have them to do a contest to come up with the best voting rights video and award prizes. That might generate some interest by young people to get more actively engaged in the process. And we post it on our webpage and maybe partner with some television stations so they can show some of the work that they are doing. We partner with KPRC Channel 2 here on election day and have an election helpline where we answer the phone when people call in to ask questions, whether they're registered to vote, where's the closest polling location. If they're having problems at the polling location, we alert the newsroom at KPRC and they send somebody out there to investigate. So we are trying to form a more collaborative working relationship with other groups, and we're reaching out. We do naturalization ceremonies. And I just reached out to the new person who's taken over naturalization to see if we can put our FYI pamphlet in the new citizens package so they have direct information about the league. Before, when COVID was happening, we put a note card on the voter registration card telling them, congratulating them, and telling them where they could go for information about elections and voting on our website. So we're hoping we can put a pamphlet in the packet that would help and reach out to those individuals who are newly franchised, that newly sworn in citizens, so they could be educated about the election process. We're trying. It just seemed like the effort has to be more on the get out the vote effort now. We are doing a great job with registration, but getting people to polling location. We partner with Metro, the transportation system in the city of Houston. And last year they provided a whole week of free rides to the poll on their trains and buses so people can get to the polling location. I'm not sure what else, maybe partner with some groups in communities and have get out to vote rally. We reached out to the Houston the basketball team, the NBA, the Rockets, trying to partner with them. We figured if they'd have a rally, they would get people out. I figured, you know, sport teams, they're always popular. We did voter registration at the Houston Astros game. The year before, we did registration at the Houston Texans game. But we need to get people out to vote. The bottom line is that we have to concentrate our effort on getting people to polling location, educating them so they can make informed decision. Because as Albert Einstein said, we can't keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. We are the change if we want to see it happen. At least I believe that. And I feel like we have to each do our own little part to make a difference in our community.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for, where's Sherry?
She's on.
Where?
She's waving at you.
Oh. Thank you for letting me volunteer.
Oh,
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. Thank you very much.
You see my, bye.
Sherry, do you see her caller?
Sherry,
She's on mute. I'm sorry.
Yeah.